Hey, so just before we get started, if you're looking to download the project file for this video, it will be getting sent out in my newsletter tomorrow. So sign up to that in the description below if you haven't already. I'll be sending out a load of stuff, but it's the general way for me to get in touch with my audience. And secondly, I just finished recording this and I realized I'm chewing gum in this video because my mic's a lot better now. I kind of picked it up here and there. I do have some noise reduction on, but I'm hoping that it doesn't kind of irk anyone out. If it does turn me down, I do apologize. I'm never going to do that again. And enjoy the video. What is up, people? My name is Anton and welcome back to September. Today, we'll be working through creating the render you just saw using some advanced cloner techniques. So what we're essentially going to be doing is starting off with modeling the sort of flip spheres, I call them, and we're going to be working through using cloners and then some shading techniques on that cloner to create a map of where you want them to sort of like flip and rotate across the entire thing and animate that over a 10-second period. We're going to finish off with some rendering, or maybe at the start, a little bit of look development here and there, but the general goal is to create the render that you just saw. So if you like the look of that, stay tuned. I'll be running through the problems and sort of bridges I had to cross to get there, and some little things you need to be aware of using Octane and Cinema 4D. So without any further ado, I've got my regular setup here. I've got 300 frames in Cinema 4D 2023 with the renderer set to Octane and the resolution set to my monitor resolution, which is here. And firstly, we're going to start by modeling the item itself. I don't want to give it a weird name. So we'll start off by just grabbing a cylinder and scaling this right down now. Because we'll be cloning it so much and we haven't really figured out our camera angles yet, we'll probably use something fairly similar. We don't need a load of detail, but it's important to get somewhat of the right shape. But in general, the modeling isn't too hard. We're going to enable some fillets here. We can do is increase the rotation segments. I was going to say we're going to use a subsurface, subdivision surface, but we probably won't because we've got enough control here in the rotation segments and it gives us enough to do. So what I'm doing here is I just duplicated the Cinema 4D like unbaked cylinder because it allows you to scale it down in a uniform way. And I've created this smaller one inside of the original here, which is what we're going to set a different material to create the emissive nature of the internal of the item. What we're going to do after this is basically set a different color to each side of that emissive sphere. So it has a difference when it flips over, but we'll get into that in a sec. Firstly, we've pretty much already modeled what we want here. And something that I kind of found is you want to dial in. You want to change your like roundedness or like the overall shape of your cylinder according to how close or far away your camera is. That sounds a little strange, but for example, if you were wanting to create more of like a sharp circular shape, you can dial that in just here, or rather you can change the caps just like that. And this is where you basically control how rounded you want it. Be careful not to increase the segments too much because it's gonna get pretty intensive. But something like this, if you're trying to recreate, would probably be pretty good. If you are wanting to use a more low poly approach, you can drop it into subdivision surface later. Just work with what your computer specifications are and your kind of requirements. But for now, this is something that would work pretty nicely. Now, just to get started, I'm going to quickly open up the Octane Live viewer so I can get the materials set up for this, because I always like to do that first because it's a little more fun. So I've got the color space set to aces and we're working path tracing. And to start off with, what I'm going to do is drop in a HDRI environment. And I've got one pre-prepared here, which is the same ambient white from last time, basically creating that washed out color. We'll drop that in, make sure we're setting this to aces. We can probably whack the power up a little bit, because we are creating more of a sort of white, lighter render. So it's important that the color palette sort of reflects that. What we can do is head to materials, create, and we can create an Octane standard surface material. And this is what we'll be starting off with. We're going to drop that on you can probably just drag it here like that. And you can see that's applied it to our surface material there. Now, just so we know what we're dialing in, we can also create our first diffuse material. And this is what's going to be emissive. So we can drop that on, head into the node editor quick, and just drop down an emission. I don't know if we even need a node. We can just click black body emission for now. And that has turned there. We just can't see it yet. We can recreate this, and let's take a look at dialing in the subsurface so we can see what is beneath it. Firstly, in the new standard surface, this is super easy. I found this really useful. You've got the subsurface layer here, a lot easier than before in Octane. Redshift was sort of better than this, even though it took much longer to render. You can set the weight to 1, and it is, believe it or not, showing what is beneath it. I'm going to duplicate the Octane sky here so that I can clear 1 to make it black and set that to the primary environment. So, or rather, the visible environment. What that's going to do is basically use the original HDRI that I put in, but just show me a black background so I can work with what's actually here. And straight away, we can see that we really need to turn down that emission. So it's got the power of, let's set that to a power of, okay. Take this in, maybe turn down the power of the, is what we need to work with some stuff. So let's take a look at the subsurface. So we've got diffuse roughness of 1. Let's keep that up. We can turn down the specular roughness here, probably. What we're really looking for is a defined shape in there. So we're going to drop down a colorizer node. Just make sure we're moving over to the side here. Drop that in, connect that up to the texture. This is where we can control what color we're missing, color we're showing. We're going to create just a nice red here, and you can see we're getting something decent. And now there's a few controls in the standard surface that we need to be aware of that are probably affecting the way that this is being shown. So obviously, okay, so the roughness isn't doing as much as I thought. I expect the majority of these settings are in the subsurface scattering here. So if we were to set that to 0, you can see it blocks it. We could dial that up to 0.5. We're looking for that, sort of turns it down a little bit. And this looks like where you can sort of control the lightness. So the higher it is, the more scattering is going to be occurring inside your geometry. We want something which is, you know, somewhat visible. So let's start with this. Maybe we can delete that Octane sky now and start taking a look here. So cool. This is looking a little dark. So maybe if we compensate the lower subsurface with a higher rate here, we can see what this is looking like. I'm thinking of scaling this down just a little bit more here. Maybe something more like this. That looks pretty cool. And again, here we can have a little control. So this is set to white. Let's make the base layer 1. That's going to really turn up the lightness of our render here. It depends what your lighting setup is like, but here, because we're using stuff which is quite washed out, roughness is probably going to have more of a negative effect. So it's just going to blanket everything, as opposed to if you had more directional lights and you wanted to get the sharpness, you could have the roughness turned right down. But to start off with, this looks pretty cool. Again, I don't seem to have a lot of luck when I turn that HDRI all the way up, but for now, let's start with something a little like this. We've got the basis for our model here. In fact, let's turn the brightness up slightly. And I think all we're gonna have to do now is just rotate this a little bit, just to catch some of the cool areas, catch some of the nice edges. Anyway, cool. So we've saved this up already, which makes it easy, and we can get started on the cloners. So simply, we're gonna get ourselves a cloner. I'm in the wrong tab. I'm gonna get a cloner. We're gonna probably bake these together. In fact, just before getting ahead of myself, we're going to deselect this, and we're just looking at the emissive material now. What we want to do is create 2 different emissions for either side of this material, and that's what's going to cause the difference in light when this model actually flips. So again, sort of overcomplicated that explanation, but we're going to duplicate the emission and just head over here and make the other colorizer a complementing color. So we've got a red here, and we'll just go with maybe something which is a blue like last time. Looks pretty cool. So let's go with the blue. Easiest way of doing this is heading to firstly, we can hit C on it. We can head to the polygon select mode, go to a side view here, just zoom in And if we get a rectangle selection tool, we can just drop in here, pick something which is about here, just the other half, grab the material, drag it on, easy. Now you can't see it in here, but I assure you, you can sort of see it because you're just viewing a complete emissive material. If we make the other one visible, we have red, number 1, and we have on the other side more of a blue. Now this is where we can do a little bit of look development because that blue is quite overpowered, and all we can do is sort of turn down the emissions of both of these. Let's head into the node editor. Depends what you want the sort of parenting color to be, for lack of a better word. Maybe we can turn these both to 0.5, and then this is a little more in control. We sort of got more of a purpley blue emission there, and up top we have the red. So cool, nice one. Let's get started with the cloner, like I said. So now that we've got this set up, we can hit C on the other one, right click, and just go connect objects and delete. That's gonna assign some polygon selection tags to where those materials are inside the model. So this is just a destructive way of doing it. You won't be able to back into it without Control Z in quite a few times, but if you're happy with what you made, you're free to do it. So now we can start with the cloner, like I said. We can grab the baked model, and just hover over it. The reason we connected those two is because you want the cloner to treat each model as a separate one. If you were to put multiple items into the cloner, it would assign them all essentially scattered or iterating across the surface, so separating them essentially. It's not what we want in this case. So the cloner by default is using a grid setup, and we want something a little different. We want to be cloning them around a sphere. So the way we do that is basically creating a source sphere. So we're going to scale this up a little bit. We're going to zoom out, and we can pretty much set this as invisible and set the cloner to object, pick the object sphere here. And okay, we need to set it visible, but we can do this. Now you can see this is iterating across the sphere, cloning it across the sphere, but it's doing it in a bit of a weird way. It's doing it against the wrong rotation. We can control that just by heading into the transform effectors inside the cloner and setting this to 90 degrees. And now we can see that it's still doing it randomly, but it is working. So we can head into the object settings and the distribution here. We have some options. So surface is basically like you probably guess, treating the sphere as a surface and randomly scattering it across that. If we set it to vertex, it's going to take into account the sphere polygons and put them on the corners. Likewise, if we set this to edge, it's going to work on the edges. So edge in particular, I found sort of had more of a nice alternating approach to scattering the spheres, which is kind of what we're after. So as you can see, we can't control too much in the cloner in regards to how this is scattering now because of setting it to edge. We have some offset stuff which works, but we want the equal distance between them. So what we can do is head into sphere here and change the polygon type. If I turn this off, as you can see, it's going to change it from standard to icosahedron. This just generally makes the polygons on the sphere more equal rather than all converging in one point. And if we were to turn that cloner back on, we can start to see some of the shapes we're making here. So again, let's just flick between something that works. In this case, after changing it to icosahedron, move it to vertex because it has a better look. And this is where you can, this is procedural, thankfully. So we can work with something like 22, which looks pretty cool. And we're getting some nicely spaced spheres here. Hi, this is Anton from later in the video. When you're making this cloner, make sure you set the instance mode to multi-instance. We'll use that for now. Reason being, right now it's multiplying each of those cylinders, those models individually, essentially duplicating them, and the program's trying to calculate every single one individually. Total craziness. Do not do that. When you set it to instance, it basically references the original one. So you're not going to have as much sort of extracurricular control, I guess you could say, but it's going to do exactly what we need it to do in this scene. Thank you very much. Again, scale is pretty important in this case. We'll see that become more relevant when we start moving with cameras, animating cameras. But for now, the scale of the spheres is pretty cool. I'd suggest not making them too small because you want the proportions in your scene to look right and your framing and such. And if you're trying to make it too complicated or too much stuff in your scene, it can look a little off unless you're working with really powerful software. Hint, hint, Houdini. But for now, this works pretty well for us. And you can see we're emitting the blue side. So this is a pretty good opportunity to show the control. So we have this set to 90, which is the blue side. And if we set that to -90, it's now going to show the red. And this is what we're going to be leveraging to create the look we want to create. So let's make this sphere invisible. And now we can see through what we've made. So if we just grab a Octane camera, we can set this to 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then we can move this out, set the focal length to something which is nice and zoomed in. I don't like using 35 for some reason. I use it when I need to, and we can start creating just a quick camera angle. So firstly, let's lock this up to working resolution. And we can get ourselves a circle, which is always a good tip if you're animating cameras or setting them up. It's going to add a circle to the origin point of the scene. And now if you were to rotate this circle, it's going to rotate the camera around that origin point, which is much easier than positioning it in a crazy way. So for now, let's take this and we can, let's get a nice arch going on there. We can work with something like this. Again, sort of working in proportion and creating something that looks ultimately pretty cool. The focal length in this case is going to be related to how these spheres sort of converge on the edges. Now that sounds kind of complicated, but if I was to turn this to 35 and zoom in, you're going to see that these ones here seem much more zoomed in and closer, and the ones on the edge sort of vanish into the distance. We're working on quite a small scale, but if we were to turn this up to like 200, and zoom out, you're going to see them all start to look a little more uniform. And this is cool when you're working in look development and you're trying to, work with scales and proportions and such. Like I say, pretty cool tool to use in your toolbox if you're trying to create some cool stuff. But this is pretty nice, and we're gonna take a look at this to start off with. Now, what we can do next is start looking at the shaders. So inside the cloner effector here, we're going to pause this for a second and just head to visual shading here. So we can see we're working with, inside the cloner, there is there's an effectors tab. We're going to get a MoGraph effector and we're going to get a shader effector. And this is what is going to allow us to control which of these spheres are rotated. We head to cloner here, drop the shader in. You can see it's worked like a normal effector and basically scaled them all up. We don't want to do that. So what we're going to do is leave the settings at 0 for now. We're going to head into the shading tab, drop this down and click noise. And what that's going to do is import the max on noise. And this is essentially a map of figuring out where it's white, it's going to have one rotation, where it's black, it's going to have the other. But if we were to zoom this in, so scale this up to maybe 400, head in here and set the effector to the rotation that we want. So we can see what we're doing here. Let's set this to 180, which is obviously the complete flip. You can see it's doing it in a bit of a weird way. It's because the noise is currently a gradient, it's really blurred. There's all sorts of values in between white and black that are spread out over the map. And that's what's contributing to the random rotations. In fact, most of them are sitting pretty vertical, and this isn't what we want. What we can do to fix this is head down to the contrast layer and turn that all the way up to 100%. And now it looks back to normal, but if I was to render this, you can see that it's essentially picking out random spheres which are rotated either one direction or the other. So it's an absolute 180 degree, and you can sort of see that representation in the noise map here. This is what we want. And if we were to, you can see, dial in or out of that contrast, we can work with it. If you were to play this, obviously nothing's happening, and we want to create a animation, then we can actually keyframe the evolution of this noise inside here. Now, if we just work with animation speed, for example, you can see it is working, but quite slowly. And another thing that we need to realize at this point is because it's absolute, it's working in less than a frame to flip those spheres. So we're not really seeing anything happen. To visualize it, little tip is we can head into cloner, MoGraph effector, and get a delay effector. If we set this to spring, that's going to create some intermediate animation between them all, and through playing it, we can now see that these spheres are flipping kind of like we want them to. And this is where we can really do some look development. If we head into the shader tab, let's go into the sphere, and stuff like scale, for example, is going to decide the way in which these sort of like clump together and the shapes that are made between the lights. So see what looks best. We kind of want more rotation really. So we've got some going on here. Maybe we need to zoom this in much more. This to about 10,000. You can sort of work here. Let's take a look. The animation speed is pretty low. So maybe if we turn that up, now we're starting to see more spheres here. It would be useful if we could see what color the emission is. So let's take a look into, actually, let's just start preview rendering this. And maybe we can get an idea of some of these shapes. I'm going to turn the delay effector up a little bit. And we can see we're getting a lot of reds. We're getting some whites. And honestly, it looks pretty cool. At this point, the more spheres you have, or the more clones you have, the more obvious that gradient's going to be, especially if they're way more densely packed together. We could do that. If we wanted to turn this up to, say, 30, we're going to need to reset this a little bit. It's going to go a bit crazy. We don't really want them intersecting. So what we can do is just turn down the scale ever so slightly to maybe 0.9, 0.9, 0.9. And just sort of scanning around. Yeah, this looks decent. We've got some slight intersection there. So just again, iterating that down, 0.85, rather, just like this. Okay, 0.8, 0.8, 0.8, just fix it until it works. And we've got something that looks a little better. And now we can see that again, we're getting a lot of red, and that is likely due to the size of the noise that we're working with. So if we head to, rather we're in the delay there, if we go to the noise, set this to maybe 5,000, which is a little more accessible. We can now see, if we were to pause this, we're getting some nice sort of oceans of movement, and it's working super fast. Let's go back to 0.25 and set this to quick shading. Maybe we can give this a quick render. Let's have a look. This is looking cool. So we've got some red, some blue, and if we were to go into our original camera angle, we are starting to recreate the look. So this looks nice. If we were to just pause this, because the interactive render is going to be a little slow, you can start to see the flipping and the look, the pace of the shots that you're making. If we were to increase the delay, this is going to exaggerate each of those flips basically. So this is where it makes it look a little more like there's actually forces involved, and it's going to give you some more movement. So just doing some on the spot look development here, but I think in general this is pretty good. I'm trying to see if anything's sort of jumping out to me, but this looks nice. So let's work with the subsurface scattering a little bit. It's looking quite grey in the background there. So maybe if we rotate this round, you want to really leverage the whiteness of that subsurface and the original material. That's what's going to make it look pretty great. So if we were to head into the subsurface level here, maybe we can turn this up a little bit. The higher you turn that subsurface, the more it's going to refract that light, but it's doing a pretty good job. So our background's quite grey there. Maybe if we were to dial this up to something that works for us, we can start matching it with the environment a little bit more. And stuff like this is starting to look quite cool. Also, you've got to bear in mind that what subsurface is essentially doing is, like I said, refracting the light that's on the inside. It's a little different to transmission or glass or specular materials, because it's basically bouncing the light constantly around the inside. It's pretty similar to if you just had a specular material and you were turning the roughness up, but it is different. You'd see subsurface scattering on stuff like skin material, stuff like plants, bits like that. So the two main factors that are really going to affect the look here are changing the emission of the internal material and the HDRI. So that's what you're trying to balance. I find myself doing this a lot when I'm making shots. It's really about balance, all sorts of stuff with scale, with color, with light, especially when you get into complicated materials. Stuff like this is pretty important. So like we can see here, we're getting some quite washed out whites, and it doesn't look too good on the gray background. So if you were to rotate this a little bit, maybe something like this would look a little better. And even at this point, if you were really having trouble matching your HDRI to what you're making, you can do what I did at the start, which is a technique that you really use this with Octane, but taking your original, duplicating it, and setting the other one to visible. Now, because these are set the same, it hasn't made a difference, but this allows us to change the color of the back plate of our render to sort of match more to what we're working with. So for example, this looks good. This looks better. So let's change that to 1.2. We're just going to lighten up a little bit, but not so bright that it just completely washes the entire shot out. This looks cool. Now, things I'm bearing in mind here is that I would like this blue to be a little more saturated. And what we can do is just head to our colorizer tab here, maybe work with something a little more. So if we were to shift this hue, or anyway, something that contrasts more to the red, we could do that. And we're getting more of a purple now, which again looks pretty similar to that red. Maybe we could even go for a lime green if that's what you wanted to do. But it does seem to wash out a lot. So if you were to tone this down, you're starting to get more true to the color that you like. If we were to drop in here, we're getting, see, that's far more of a green. So the higher your power is, the more white it's going to become. That's kind of the way emissive materials work. And stuff like this looks pretty nice. So in a sense, you're kind of selecting a parenting color here that you're going to use in the emission. In my case, it's more of this red. And then you're going to have a secondary one which sort of shines through. And maybe we can set this to 0.2. 0.2 doesn't look too bad. And that is more along the lines of what I like. So at this point, we're just going to really do some final sort of scene setup stuff. You can also, if you wanted to make this a little more interesting, do some more stuff to the model. So if we were to grab this cylinder and we didn't want to mess up the scene, we can just open up a new project, head inside here and taking a look at just little things we could do to make this a little more interesting. So we head to the line shader here. What we could do is head into our line connector, line tool, modeling tool for a sec. Hit select, let's right click and create a loop path cut. And what it's going to do is, as we hover over a line, it's going to create an outline of a line that will basically cut into the geometry, which we can then model with. So say we've got an emissive material in here. Let's just create let's run with like a circular vibe like I did before. We can create two cuts there, one in front and the other, and it's created this sort of segmented loop. And let's make another one, maybe just here. I'm not going to do too much of this because you can obviously do what you like here. And we can go to select, we can get a loop selection, or we need to go back to the faces now, and we can pick these two ones that we just clipped, hitting shift on our keyboard. And then we can go to the scale tool, for example, or the move tool, and we can just hit shift and, or rather control, I think, and move this down. And now it's going to create these cool cuts. So if we want something really minor, we can just do something like this, and that's going to create a nice bit of interest in the shape rather than having nothing. And you can do something on the other side too. In fact, for the sake of showing, I'm going to do the same thing. So we head to draw shading and just pick ourselves a right click, make sure we're staying on line, right click, go loop path cut, and we're going to extrude one this time. So we're going to create two pretty close to each other, just like this. And then one more time, head to selecting the shapes. We're going to go to select, loop selection, pick it out, head to the movement, and just extrude this up, making sure we're holding control on our keyboard. And now we're going to create something like this. So a little bit more interest. At this point, you want to really create a subdivision surface for this. Otherwise, these lines here are going to look a little weird. You might be able to drop into a fillet effector, but I think for the other one, I just moved it in like this, and it's going to round these off a little more. Let's set the subdivision to 1. Subdivision won't render it to 1, 2. It's still going to give the same effect, but without crashing the program. So if we was just retry this, if it's still a problem, we can use the remesh tool. But for now, I don't see this being too much of a problem. Maybe we can connect objects and delete, copy this, and paste this into our cloner just one more time. Again, pretty high density, but if we were to render this, it is responsive, which is, of course, a plus. And now we're rendering. It's going to take a very long time, so let's just set our samples down to maybe something like 500 and the GI clamp to 16. Let's work with what we're going here, and now we can see some of the effects of the modeling we just did. So we've got some cool stuff going on here. Let's take a look at what we can fix. The cylinder, we're going to need to look at another way of rounding off these edges slightly. So let's try route 1. So there's a fillet effector here, bevel. Let's drop that bevel beneath the cylinder, and that sort of round the stuff off without crashing our program. Cool. Maybe if we work with the offset, I think the offset is the parameter which we want. Yeah, we can set that to maybe even 0.1. We want these really small. Something like this, 0.3. You can increase the subdivisions here. Cool. So that allows us to really niche down what we're doing. And I think for now, that kind of does the job quite well. So use the bevel tool, not the subdivision surface. Otherwise, everything will break. We're going to delete this before it tries to render again. Drop this in. And all right, cool. So we're back here. The program nearly crashed. Make sure you're using multi-instance. What we can do is start creating our scene again. So we've got our beveled shapes in. The subdivision surface is working nicely, just like we want. And it's creating some nice darker spots. Maybe if we were to dial in here, this is where we can work with some of the, if we were to turn the specular roughness down, maybe set this to 1. Set the base layer, we've got some diffuse roughness here. We can leave that at 1 as well. And let's just create a more zoomed in camera. I know, even more zoomed in. Let's just take a look at what we're making. And we can see we're getting some nice sort of crevices, which is going to add some shadow and just a little more interest. The reason these are so dark is because of the distance that I extruded. You can probably tone that down if that's not what you like, but for now, these are kind of looking pretty sick. So heading back out here, maybe we can work with rotating this. I still want this to be a little lighter, so another way you can kind of do it is just turning up the exposure. Here, maybe we can make this 1.2. We're getting quite a warm look here, but that's something that you can change in post. Or if you didn't like the red look and you wanted more of a cool look, we should be able to just swap these materials around. So if we wanted this to be the more overpowering material, in fact, we can probably just change the emission power here. I believe I had blue set to, let me double check, 0.2, and the red is set to, the red is set to 0.5. So let's just swap those around, just get the cooler look. Give this a render, and it's going to tone down some of that washed out red that we were sort of finding, which is sweet. Maybe at this point we can even make that red a little bit more of an orange, which I think complements the blue a little nicer. So maybe we can work with something like this. It's coming out as more of a yellow, but I mean, even that looks pretty nice. So again, here, depends what kind of look you're going for. You can tone down your HDRI completely. You can make it 0.1, 0.5. You can go for more of a gray or a white at this stage. I think something like this wouldn't look too bad. And let's just work on some final look development now. So we can head into our camera. We can go to the thin lens, depth of field, make sure we're unchecking that. Again, super easy way. We can just set our focus point to be, for example, the middle, and set our aperture to maybe something like 5. Style that up a little bit. It's creating some nice blur in the background. Maybe we can turn that up even more, make something like 20 or even 50. This is where the scale you're working in and stuff helps. And we can start to see some of these looks. So let's have a little play around. If we were to play this, just double check what our clone is doing. Pretty cool. These are looking more like discs now rather than what we had before. And I kind of like the symmetrical look to this. So the fact that these are centered and these are all organized look pretty nice. Something you might have noticed if you're watching this, and I'm noticing it too, is that they're not all uniform. There's kind of, and this is because of the way we set that sphere to icosahedron at the start. Some of these are converging a little slightly closer, and others are further away, and it sort of orients round the sphere. So if you didn't like that, we can just grab the cloner, and I'm pretty sure we can just rotate this down a little bit to get rid of that bit there. And something like this looks a little nicer. If we were to shoot render on that, again, we're starting to develop our looks here. So let's see. I'm going to work through this, see if there's anything final that I can do. I do kind of want this to be moved up a little bit. So let's work with something like this. And in general, we're recreating the look. The yellow's a little washed out. And if you're trying to work with the scales of which are one color and which are the other, just to reiterate, if you head into the shader effector and turn down the scale of your noise here, that's really going to be your control of that. But every time you do that, make sure you replay the animation so you can sort of see this is a much more scaled down noise now. And you can kind of see, you'll get a feel for it, but you can imagine sort of the noise being mapped across this. If we were to play this, we can take a look and we can play it. And now we can see some of these flipping. Final thoughts is we want a little bit of motion blur to this. So if we would head into motion blur, make sure we're enabling this and set this to 0.0333 if you're working in 30 FPS. That's going to enable some motion blur. The point that's worth mentioning is Octane doesn't actually like applying motion blur to instances the way we've done it here. It is an issue in the software, and I think particularly in past versions, it wasn't working like you wanted it to. I managed to fix this just by restarting Octane a few times. And you can kind of see whether it's the depth of field that's called giving the illusioner effect, you'll start to see it on the edges. We want to make sure we're obviously adding ourselves a extension, Octane light tag, object tag even, making sure the motion blur is set to transform vertex. And in principle, we should start to see some motion blur. If not, we're going to add it in DaVinci Resolve because there is a way you can do it. But the scene in general is starting to look pretty cool. At this point here, we can, for example, add a little bit of highlight compression. We can start working with the colors and recreating the look that we like. We can even tone down the HDRI if we're finding that it's too washed out. Start controlling some of those colors, dialing in those whites, working with the scattering, setting this to 2 even maybe. And now we're starting to get more of a white look. And depending on how you're using the scene, you can now essentially structure this out and render it. Hey, so again, just a quick one. If you were trying to recreate that and you had issues with motion blur and either your Octane wasn't up to date or restarting your program didn't work, this is a quick loop around solution for the pretty specific situation we had there with the instances and stuff. And this should work. So let me know. But what we essentially have here is we're inside DaVinci Resolve, which is free, which is cool. And we have the clips basically brought in. This is the original render and nothing special really done here. Some minor color correction. But if we head into the Fusion tab, there are 2 nodes that we're really looking for. So if we were to just, I don't think there's any settings which are even particularly relevant on here. So we have 2, we have optical flow and vector motion blur. So if we were to delete those, we have media in into media 1 out. And that's just basically rendering it. If we were to right click and hit add tool, firstly, I think under the blur tab, we have vector motion blur. So that is important. And before that, we want an optical flow. So if we head here, and just drop down the optical flow node, I'd be lying to you if I said I know exactly what these do, but these worked for me. So you can see we have areas of movement here. If we were to connect this in, it adds a slight little bit of blur. You have the scale here, which presumably decides how much motion blur you have. And so you can use this for any render really. It seemed to do pretty good for me. But if you would skip to the front here, I sort of play this through, it adds a motion blur and just adds an extra little bit of sheen to your scene. Well, rhyming. So use that technique if you're trying to add some motion blur and render this out looking nice. So if you follow through this whole way, and you've remade something similar, or you're just looking for little clips and processes which might help you, let me know. Have a mess around, dial with all the settings I explained, and then make your own thing. It's a pretty cool way of doing things. And that is essentially the basics of some advanced cloner tips and making some stuff look pretty cool. So if you need anything, send it to me at SeptemberDSG on Instagram, and I will see you soon with some more stuff. Thank you everybody for watching.